Pleased to introduce the Suicide
Minister.
Prevention Bill 2021 into the House of Assembly, and I think I need to move that it be read a second time.
You do.
The Marshall Liberal Government has a strong commitment to suicide prevention. From opposition we committed to, and in government we delivered the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention, and the Premier appointed the Premier's Advocate for Suicide Prevention. A priority of the Mental Health Services Plan 2020 to 25 is towards zero suicide. This is a long-term, evidence-informed investment approach across South Australia's local health networks and primary health networks over a 4-year period. The bill seeks to establish a sustained approach to suicide prevention through whole-of-community and whole-of-government action to reduce the rate of suicide in South Australia. This bill is the first of its kind for any jurisdiction in Australia and will set a precedent for how suicide prevention is addressed in Australia. The objects of this bill are to reduce the incidence of suicide in the state, promote best practice suicide prevention policies across the state, to articulate the role of the state in implementing suicide prevention strategies, to provide for training and education in relation to suicide prevention, provide for the identification of priority population groups and implementing suitable initiatives to prevent suicide within such groups, and to provide a framework to ensure that suicide prevention response is a priority across all levels of government and community. These objects establish the whole-of-community and whole-of-government framework for suicide prevention, set out the focus of action through the components of the bill. The bill provides for a Suicide Prevention Council. This will be a statutory body that will take over the role and responsibilities of the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention, which was primarily established as a ministerial committee. The proposed statutory-based Suicide Prevention Council will have 13 members who, in the opinion of the Minister, collectively have the knowledge, skills and lived experience to enable the Council to carry out its functions. There is a further requirement that of the 13 members, there will be at least one member who has experience of leadership in suicide prevention initiatives or services in a non-government organisation. Another who has experience in a leadership position in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Experience in a leadership position and being an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, has experience in a leadership position in the multicultural community, is a veteran with lived experience of suicide or experience in supporting veterans with this lived experience. Is a member of the LGBTIQ+ community with lived experience of suicide or has leadership experience in this community, has lived experience of suicidal behaviour, is a clinical professional with experience in providing care to people with lived experience of suicide or who may be at risk of suicide, is a person with experience in suicide prevention commissioning from primary health networks, and is a researcher with expertise in suicidology or suicide prevention or mental health. To be clear, that is the skill sets that collectively must be comprised by the Council. At least one member must demonstrate each of those attributes. For the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and multicultural communities, a member with experience in a leadership position is required. This ensures there is knowledge of and capacity to effectively engage with and their respective communities' experiences of suicide across the state. Whilst having lived experience of suicide is not an explicit requirement for these and some of the other prescribed members, lived experience of suicide will be a consideration when nominations are made. The bill, following amendment in the other place, now requires one member who must be a first responder with lived experience of suicide or experience in a leadership position as a first responder. This is an important measure due to the high occupational exposure of first responders to trauma and traumatising events. This inclusion is wholeheartedly supported, welcomed by the government. The Minister will still have discretion to appoint 2 other members to either enhance the Council's knowledge, experience and skills as may be needed, for example, of lived experience or other emerging priority groups, issues or expertise. This membership is complemented by a Member of Parliament not being a Minister of the Crown, appointed by the Minister on the nomination of the Premier, and ex officio members including the Chief Public Health Officer, the Chief Psychiatrist, the Chief Executive of Wellbeing SA, the Commissioner for Aboriginal Engagement, the Commissioner for Children and Young People and the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, and a Mental Health Commissioner. This membership provides an opportunity to significantly reflect the interests of priority groups disproportionately affected by suicide or attempted suicide. The bill sets out the functions and powers of the Suicide Prevention Council, which are primarily to prepare and maintain the State Suicide Prevention Plan and to make recommendations on policies and programs intended to reduce deaths by suicide and attempted suicides and enhance post-vention responses. There are further functions and powers described, including to receive reports from prescribed state authorities in relation to their suicide prevention plans and promote and support the work of suicide prevention networks. The Suicide Prevention Council may establish committees or advise it or carry out functions on its behalf, and will have the power to delegate a functional power to specified persons or a committee. The bill establishes the State Suicide Prevention Plan and what it must include in the consultation requirements. The State Suicide Prevention Plan is also required to contain a part relating to suicide prevention for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to reflect the need to address and reduce the rates of suicide and suicide attempts in these communities. The bill establishes a duty of state authorities, as defined, to have regard to and give effect to the State Suicide Prevention Plan, and for certain state authorities to have suicide prevention action plans. What must be included in these plans particularly give effect to the State Suicide Prevention Plan. Annual reporting is required by the Suicide Prevention Council, state authorities, and on the operation of the State Suicide Prevention Plan, establishing a high level of accountability, including across government, for reporting on the effectiveness of suicide prevention efforts of the Council and state authorities. The bill also establishes a significant suicide prevention public health measure, which enables the Minister to make recommendations relating to suicide prevention, requiring either specific action or action of a specified kind to be taken or stopped to reduce the risk of suicide occurring at a particular place or places of a particular kind, or amongst particular groups of people, and that certain voluntary steps be taken in relation to the packaging, manufacture or sale of controlled lethal means of a particular kind in the state. Certain consultation requirements apply before declaring that something to be a controlled lethal means or make recommendations. While the Minister may publish non-compliance with recommendations, there is also a requirement for ensuring procedural fairness and review by the Tribunal. The Minister, the Chief Public Health Officer or the Chief Psychiatrist may require a state authority to provide a report or specified persons or bodies to provide information or documents reasonably required for the performance of functions under the Act. A penalty may apply where a person refuses or fails to comply with a notice. The bill also establishes a requirement to share information between certain persons and bodies for the purpose of the Act, and establishes the South Australian Suicide Register. In doing so, there are strong confidentiality provisions that will ensure the protection of personal information and indicate how information will be made available. The primary aim of the South Australian Suicide Register is to capture all suicides in the state in order to use the data collected as an evidence base for public health action at the population level to further prevent further suicides from occurring. A primary function of the Suicide Register will be to classify all received notifications of possible suicides to determine that a death was due to suicide, which would then be used with other data to inform suicide classifications. For example, likely suicide, potential suicide, unlikely to be known or under investigation. Data will also be captured on a range of elements that are obtainable at the population level that are either known or potential risk factors to a person's likelihood of suicide. An amendment made in the other place removed reference to suicide attempts in Clause 35(1) because this would jeopardise the remit and integrity of the register. Physical health and mental health conditions, including past suicide attempts and other life events and stressors, will be data elements collected in the register. This data will provide a better capacity to analyse suicidality by ensuring high quality and reliable data, and this in turn will ensure an evidence base for population-level public health action to prevent further suicides from occurring. This bill has been subject to extensive consultation. Letters inviting submissions reached more than 576 individuals and organisations, including the Honourable David Coleman MP, Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, all members of the South Australian Parliament, relevant unions, professional associations, government agencies, members of the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention, the Government Issues Group, the Suicide Prevention Networks, members of Lived Experience Register, chief executive officers and clinical mental health leads of local health networks, and the South Australian Ambulance Service, primary health networks, chief executives and chairs of national mental health organisations, including, among others, the Suicide Prevention Australia, Beyond Blue, the National Mental Health Commission, Lifeline Australia, the Black Dog Institute, among others, Priority Population Group community organisations, and South Australian non-government organisations involved in providing mental health services or advocacy. It's possible that paragraph may well answer a question that might come in committee. Publicity was provided through the SA Health media, such as Facebook, and the bill was available for feedback on the South Australian Government's Your Say website from the 22nd of December 2020 to the 17th of February 2021, with 218 respondents through the website. There were also 30 participants through webinars and 42 written submissions that were received from a range of national and state non-government organisations, state government agencies, community organisations, professional bodies and community members, especially some people with experience of suicide. Most of the feedback was supportive of the bill, with around 88% of Your Say respondents and 90.5% of submissions supporting the introduction of legislation. As a result of this consultation and further advice from others, including the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention, several changes were made to the bill in response to feedback. They included, amongst others, adding the Commissioner for Children and Young People and the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People to the membership of the Suicide Prevention Council. Further detail on the experience collectively required by members of the Council. Clarification that the bill does not apply to voluntary assisted dying. Strengthening and adding to the functions of the Council, and restructuring the wording on making recommendations relating to suicide prevention, particularly in relation to controlled lethal means. There was feedback that did not relate to the proposed bill, but raised issues such as strategic planning for suicide prevention, service responses when a suicide occurred, and availability of services. This information has been available for inclusion as part of the consultation on the State Suicide Prevention Plan. While suicide prevention has traditionally occurred without a law, this legislation supports a sustained and effective focus on suicide prevention that is not vulnerable to changes in government priorities. The intent of this bill is to keep this focus so that individuals, families and communities see transparent and accountable action that leads to change in the rate of suicide and suicide attempts. I'd like to take this opportunity to read a statement made by members of the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention on this bill. The Suicide Prevention Bill provides a solid foundation for a high level of advocacy by a consultative group of community members from varying expertise, priority population groups at high risk of suicide and lived experience. It provides a mechanism for driving change in planning, policy and programs within a political and governance structure. This bill demonstrates a commitment by the government in further advocating for the mental health and well-being of all South Australians, that we all have a role to play and a duty to prevent loss of lives by suicide. The bill represents a groundbreaking approach to tackling one of our community's most challenging social and health issues. Committing to legislative structures, processes and mechanisms for the ongoing pursuit of reducing suicide is a visionary ambition. It is not only to be welcomed by advocates and those with a personal experience of dealing with suicide, but by the wider South Australian community. It demonstrates a leadership in public policy that is unrivalled across Australia and will show that the South Australian community is at the forefront of taking a progressive stance on suicide prevention that is unrivalled. It has been a privilege to serve on the Premier's Council on Suicide Prevention, making recommendations and providing advice in the drafting of this bill. It is our hope that all South Australians will be supported by having a consistent approach and legislative structure which explicitly aims to reduce the incidence of suicide in South Australia. So ends their statement. I commend the bill to the House.